The quaint neighborhood of Maplewood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and nothing much ever happened. So, when 35-year-old Thomas Reynolds, a successful financial consultant, and his wife Laura, a dedicated stay-at-home mother, moved into the picturesque suburban house on Willow Lane with their 2 young children, they seemed like the perfect addition to the close-knit community. They were the quintessential American family, a loving couple with 2 beautiful kids, an immaculate house, and an enviable life. But behind the idyllic facade, tensions were brewing. Laura had recently given birth to their 2nd child, and the strain of caring for a newborn and a toddler had begun to take its toll. She felt overwhelmed, exhausted, and disconnected from Thomas, who was often away on business trips. To ease the burden, they hired a babysitter, 19-year-old Megan Hill, a local college student who was looking to earn some extra money. Megan was a bright, cheerful girl who quickly bonded with the Reynolds children. She was everything Laura could have hoped for in a babysitter: responsible, caring, and always willing to help. But soon, Megan became more than just a babysitter to Thomas. It started with small things, a compliment here, a lingering glance there. Megan, flattered by the attention from the handsome older man, didn't mind the flirtation, and as the weeks went by, their interactions grew bolder. Thomas, feeling neglected and unappreciated at home, found solace in Megan's youthful energy and admiration. What began as harmless flirtation quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. One evening, after Laura had gone to bed early, exhausted from another long day with the kids, Thomas and Megan found themselves alone in the living room. The children were asleep upstairs, and the house was silent. "I don't know how you do it, Megan. The kids adore you," Thomas said, his eyes locked onto hers. Megan blushed, shrugging off the compliment. "They're great kids. I love spending time with them," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a charged silence before Thomas took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they kissed. From that moment on, their affair escalated quickly. They would sneak in quick kisses when Laura wasn't looking, send each other suggestive texts, and find any excuse to be alone together. The thrill of the forbidden relationship consumed them both, and soon they were finding every opportunity to be together whenever Laura was out running errands or visiting family. But secrets like these never stay hidden for long. Laura, though initially oblivious, began to notice the changes in her husband's behavior. He was more attentive to his appearance, always checking his phone with a sly smile, and seemed to have a renewed enthusiasm for spending time at home, especially when Megan was around. Laura's suspicions were aroused, but she couldn't believe that Thomas, her devoted husband, would ever betray her like that. Then came the night that would change everything. It was a Friday, and Laura had planned a date night for her and Thomas, hoping to rekindle the romance that had been missing for so long. She asked Megan to come over and watch the kids for the evening, thinking it would be a simple, pleasant night. But fate had other plans. Around 7 p.m., Laura left the house, dressed in her best, feeling hopeful for the first time in months. She had made reservations at their favorite restaurant and was determined to make the evening special. But less than an hour later, she realized she had forgotten her wallet. Annoyed but undeterred, she decided to swing back home to get it. What she walked into was something she could never have imagined. As she quietly opened the front door, she heard soft laughter coming from the living room. Moving closer, she saw the silhouette of her husband and Megan on the couch, locked in a passionate embrace. The sight of Thomas's hands running through Megan's hair, their lips pressed together, shattered Laura's heart. She stood there, frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. It felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. When the couple finally noticed her presence, their horrified expressions said it all. Megan jumped up, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear, while Thomas stumbled over his words, trying to come up with an explanation that would never be enough. Laura didn't say a word. She turned and walked out of the house, tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking with each step she took. She drove aimlessly for hours, the image of her husband and Megan seared into her mind, a betrayal she could never have anticipated. By the time she returned home, Megan was gone, and Thomas was waiting, his face pale and drawn. "Laura, please, I can explain," he began, but she cut him off with a single look. "There's nothing to explain, Thomas," she said, her voice cold and distant. "You've destroyed everything." The weeks that followed were a blur of anger, betrayal, and silence. Laura filed for divorce, refusing to hear any of Thomas's apologies or excuses. Megan disappeared from their lives. too ashamed to face what she had done. The once perfect family was now shattered beyond repair. But what none of them knew was that the worst was yet to come. After the discovery of the affair, the Reynolds home became a battleground. Laura moved into the guest bedroom, refusing to speak to Thomas unless it was about the children. Tension simmered beneath the surface, threatening to explode at any moment. Thomas, consumed by guilt and regret, tried to make amends, but his efforts only pushed Laura further away. Megan, meanwhile, had vanished, cutting off all contact with Thomas. Then, one night, Laura received an anonymous letter in the mail. It contained a series of photographs of Thomas and Megan in compromising situations, taken at various times during their affair. Whoever sent the letter clearly wanted to cause more pain. Enraged and humiliated, Laura showed the pictures to Thomas, throwing them at him with tears of fury in her eyes. "You've ruined our lives, Thomas, and now everyone knows," she screamed, her voice breaking. Thomas, his face ashen, denied knowing who could have taken the photos, but the damage was done. Laura's rage turned into a cold, calculating hatred. She would never forgive him, and she would make sure he paid for what he had done. Laura's anger began to fester into something darker. She started stalking Megan online, finding out everything she could about the young woman. She discovered Megan had recently started dating someone new, a local mechanic named Jake. Consumed by jealousy and a twisted sense of betrayal, Laura decided she needed to confront Megan one last time. It was a rainy Thursday evening when Laura drove to Megan's apartment. She watched from her car as Megan and Jake emerged from the building, laughing and holding hands. Laura's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she watched them kiss before getting into Jake's truck. Her heart pounded with a dangerous mix of anger and grief. As they drove away, Laura followed them at a safe distance. They ended up at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Laura parked a few spaces away, her eyes never leaving the couple. Inside, they sat at a corner booth, talking animatedly. Laura's mind raced. How could Megan move on so easily? Didn't she feel any remorse for destroying a family? The more she thought about it, the more her thoughts darkened. Laura waited for hours in her car, her gaze fixed on the diner's door. Finally, around midnight, Megan and Jake emerged. They shared a kiss before Jake got into his truck and drove off. Megan began walking back to her apartment, unaware of the eyes watching her from the darkness. Laura's hands trembled as she reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small, heavy object, a hammer. She had grabbed it on a whim before leaving the house, not really thinking about why she might need it. Now, it felt like the only thing that made sense. Her pulse roared in her ears as she got out of the car and followed Megan. Megan took a shortcut through a dimly lit alley behind the diner, her footsteps echoing softly against the wet pavement. Laura quickened her pace, the hammer clutched tightly in her hand. As she closed the distance between them, her mind was a chaotic swirl of memories and emotions. Betrayal, anger, loss. She couldn't stop now, even if she wanted to. "Megan!" she called out, her voice strained. Megan turned around, her face registering shock as she saw Laura approaching. "Laura, what are you doing here?" Megan asked, her voice laced with fear. Laura's eyes were wild, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You ruined everything, Megan. My marriage, my family, everything." Megan took a step back, her hands raised defensively. "I'm sorry, Laura. I never meant for any of this to happen." But it was too late for apologies. Laura's grip tightened on the hammer as she raised it, her vision narrowing to a tunnel focused solely on Megan. The younger woman's eyes widened in horror, but she barely had time to react before Laura swung. The hammer struck Megan on the side of the head with a sickening thud. She staggered, a look of shock and pain frozen on her face. As she collapsed to the ground, Laura stood over her, her chest heaving, the rain mixing with the blood now pooling on the ground. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The reality of what she had done slowly seeped into Laura's mind. Megan lay motionless, her eyes staring blankly into the night. The enormity of her actions crashed down on Laura, but she felt strangely detached, as if she were watching someone else commit this heinous act. Panicked, Laura dropped the hammer and fled back to her car. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she started the engine and sped away, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely think. She drove aimlessly for hours, the image of Megan's lifeless body haunting her every thought. What had she done? How could she go back now? By the time she returned home, the sun was beginning to rise. Thomas was asleep on the couch, oblivious to the horrors of the night. Laura stumbled into the bathroom, her clothes soaked and stained, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection was that of a woman she no longer recognized, someone broken, consumed by rage and regret. She stripped off her clothes, shoved them into a plastic bag, and stuffed it under the sink. She then climbed into the shower, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, as if she could wash away the sins of the night. But the guilt and fear were not so easily erased. She knew it was only a matter of time before Megan's body was discovered, and the police would come looking for answers. Laura's heart raced as she tried to think of what to do next, her mind spinning with a million possibilities, none of them good. And then, just as she was about to break down completely, she heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder, drawing nearer. The nightmare had only just begun. As the sirens grew louder, Laura's mind spun with fear and desperation. She knew she didn't have much time. She threw on a clean set of clothes, trying to steady her trembling hands. She needed to think, needed a plan, but her mind was a blur of panic and regret. She glanced at her children's bedroom door and felt a pang of guilt. What would happen to them if she was arrested? She went back to the bathroom and retrieved the plastic bag with her blood-stained clothes. She had to get rid of the evidence. Heart racing, she crept down the stairs, careful not to wake Thomas, and slipped out the back door. The sun had risen, casting an eerie calm over the neighborhood, completely out of sync with the chaos in Laura's mind. She ran to the woods behind their house and dug a shallow hole, frantically shoving the bag into it and covering it with dirt. It wasn't much, but it was all she could think of. She stumbled back to the house, her breath ragged and shallow. As she reached the back porch, she heard the sound she had been dreading, a knock at the front door. Laura froze, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it would burst. She peered around the corner and saw two police officers standing on her doorstep. Thomas, looking confused and disheveled, opened the door. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his voice groggy. "Mr. Reynolds, we're looking for your wife, Laura," one of the officers said. "There's been an incident, and we need to ask her a few questions." Thomas's eyes widened in confusion as he turned and called out, "Laura, can you come here for a moment?" Laura felt her stomach drop. Her legs felt like lead as she forced herself to walk to the door, trying to appear calm. The officers looked at her with grim expressions. "Mrs. Reynolds, there was an assault last night. A young woman, Megan Hill, was found dead in an alley near the diner on Route 4.
We have reason to believe you were the last person to see her alive," the officer said, his voice firm but not on Laura's heart. Like they had found Megan's body. She struggled to keep her composure as she nodded. Yes, I saw last night. I went to talk to her. I was upset about everything, but I didn't kill her.
The officers exchanged a look. "We need you to come down to the station with us, Mrs. Reynolds. We have some questions and it would be best if you could answer them there." Laura glanced at Thomas, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "I'll come with you," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. The drive to the police station felt like a blur. Laura's mind was racing, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and regret. How could she have done this? How could she have lost control so completely? She could still see Megan's terrified face, hear the sickening thud of the hammer, feel the weight of her own actions pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. At the station, they led her into a small interrogation room and sat her down. She clasped her hands together to stop them from shaking. The officers sat across from her, their expressions professional but cautious. "Mrs. Reynolds, we found traces of blood and hair on the hammer in your garage, and we recovered your clothing from the woods behind your house. The evidence suggests that you attacked Megan Hill," one of the officers said, his voice calm but Laura felt the room spinning around her. She had been so careless. Of course they would find hammer. Of course they would trace everything back to her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized there was no escape from what she had done. "I didn't mean to kill her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to scare her. I was so angry, so hurt. But when I saw her, I just lost control. I didn't mean for this to happen." The officers watched her, their faces impassive. "We understand this is difficult, Mrs. Reynolds, but you need to tell us exactly what happened last night." So, with a trembling voice, Laura recounted every detail. How she had followed Megan, how her anger had blinded her, how the confrontation had spiraled out of control. She confessed everything, her words tumbling out in a rush, as if speaking them could somehow undo the horror of what she had done. When she finished, the room fell silent. The officers exchanged a glance before one of them stood up. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mrs. Reynolds. We'll be in touch with your lawyer. For now, you're under arrest for the murder of Megan Hill." As they led her away, Laura felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The truth was out. There was no more hiding, no more running. The weight of her actions settled heavily on her shoulders as she was taken to a holding cell, the cold reality of her situation sinking in. She had destroyed her family, taken a life, and now she would pay the price. The once perfect life she had worked so hard to build was gone, shattered by her own hand. And as she sat alone in that cell, the enormity of what she had done pressed down on her like a crushing weight.